June 15, 1968. MACV Headquarters, Saigon. The briefing room was deliberately obscure. No windows, soundproofed walls, security clearances required just to enter. As William Colby, CIA's deputy chief of station and architect of Operation Phoenix, outlined a program that would define America's counterinsurgency strategy for next 4 years and create controversy lasting decades. I was James Jim Callahan, CIA paramilitary operations officer, 31 years old from Massachusetts, veteran of 2 years in Vietnam conducting covert operations, beginning assignment with Phoenix that would involve identifying and neutralizing Viet Cong infrastructure, the shadow government that controlled population through combination of political organizing and systematic terror. Through methods that official documents describe with bureaucratic euphemisms, but participants understood. Men capture, interrogation, and often killing of targets who might be combatants, or might be civilians whose only crime was opposing Saigon government or supporting communists for reasons having nothing to do with ideology. Operation Phoenix emerged from recognition that military operations alone couldn't defeat insurgency that drew strength from political infrastructure embedded within South Vietnamese population. The Viet Cong infrastructure, VCI, consisted of tax collectors, propagandists, recruiters, local administrators who implemented communist policies at village level, intelligence agents who identified targets for assassination or sabotage. The VCI wasn't military force that could be destroyed through conventional operations. It was political network that required police and intelligence work to identify and dismantle through arrests, defections, and when necessary, targeted killings that official terminology called neutralization, but participants and critics called assassination. Phoenix will systematically dismantle the VCI. Colby explained with clinical precision that made extrajudicial killing sound like administrative procedure. We will identify VCI members through intelligence collection, interrogation of prisoners, and information from defectors. We will classify targets by importance, a category for senior cadre, B for mid-level, C for low-level. We will neutralize targets through capture when possible, through killing when capture isn't feasible. The objective is removing communist political infrastructure that controls population and supports military operations. Success will be measured by number of VCI neutralized. Our target is 3,000 per month across South Vietnam. The quota system, 3,000 VCI neutralized monthly, would prove controversial because quotas incentivized quantity over quality, encouraged claiming anyone killed as VCI regardless of whether they actually were, created pressure to produce bodies that would corrupt program and feed criticisms that Phoenix was assassination campaign targeting civilians rather than legitimate counterinsurgency targeting combatants. But in June 1968, quotas seemed like reasonable metrics for measuring progress against enemy that couldn't be quantified through conventional battle damage assessment. The organizational structure combined American advisors with South Vietnamese operatives. Provincial reconnaissance units conducted operations, National Police Special Branch provided intelligence, CIA and military intelligence advisors coordinated and provided technical support. The American role was officially limited to advising and coordination. Vietnamese conducted operations, Vietnamese made arrest or kill decisions, Americans provided intelligence and sometimes participated but weren't supposed to be pulling triggers. That distinction would prove more theoretical than practical as operations evolved and advisors became operators. Captain Michael Mike Henderson was my counterpart from military intelligence, 33 years old from Georgia, had been in Vietnam 14 months conducting intelligence operations supporting combat units, transferred to Phoenix seeking work that seemed more directly productive than providing intelligence that combat commanders often ignored. Henderson understood that Phoenix was controversial, targeting individuals rather than military forces, operating in legal gray zones where rules of engagement were ambiguous, working with South Vietnamese whose methods sometimes exceeded what Americans consider acceptable. "You understand, this isn't conventional intelligence work," Henderson told me during our first meeting. "Phoenix is wet work, capturing and killing people based on intelligence that's often incomplete, that might be accurate or might be score-settling by Vietnamese with personal grudges. We're going to neutralize people who might be hardcore VC cadre or might be school teachers who criticize government corruption." The Vietnamese don't always distinguish, and were not always in position to verify before operations happen. You need to be comfortable with moral ambiguity, because Phoenix lives in gray zones. His warning was honest assessment, a program that would generate approximately 26,000 neutralizations between 1968 to 1972. Some undoubtedly legitimate VCI, some questionably connected to VC, some likely innocent civilians caught in program that prioritized quotas over accuracy. The moral complexity of distinguishing between combatants and civilians in counterinsurgency, where enemy deliberately blurred those distinctions, would define Phoenix and create controversies that persist 50 years later. Nguyen Van Ton was Provincial Reconnaissance Unit team leader I'd work with most closely. 42 years old, had fought against French and Viet Minh before joining South Vietnamese forces after 1954 partition, possessed tactical skills and ruthlessness that made him an effective operator and occasionally concerning ally. Ton understood local culture and politics in ways Americans couldn't, could identify VCI through networks and patterns that intelligence reports missed, conducted operations with efficiency that sometimes included brutality that exceeded American standards for treatment of prisoners. VC are everywhere, Ton told me during initial briefing on his province's VCI situation. Tax collector who visits village monthly? VC. Schoolteacher who emphasizes wrong parts of history? VC village chief who cooperates with government during day, but meets with cadre at night? VC, we know who they are. Intelligence isn't problem. Problem is catching them and making arrests stick when legal system is corrupt and judges are often VC sympathizers. Phoenix gives us authority to neutralize without legal process. That's why it will work. We can act on intelligence without lawyers blocking us. His enthusiasm for extrajudicial authority was concerning but reflected frustration with legal system that often released suspected VC for lack of evidence or through corruption. Phoenix offered alternative, neutralization without trial, based on intelligence that might not meet legal standards but that operators believed was sufficient. The trade-off was accepting that some innocents would be wrongly neutralized in exchange for successfully targeting guilty who'd otherwise escape justice. That trade-off would prove politically and morally contentious. The first Phoenix operation I participated in came June 23, 1968, raid on village northwest of Saigon, targeting VCI district-level political officer identified through prisoner interrogation and corroborated by defector information. The target, identified only as Comrade Bay, was believed responsible for coordinating VC taxation, recruiting, and political education in district with population exceeding 50,000. Intelligence assessed him as a category target whose neutralization would significantly degrade VCI capabilities. The operation brief was straightforward. PRU team would surround target's house at 0200 hours, would attempt capture, would kill if he resisted or attempted escape. American advisors, Henderson and I, would accompany to provide coordination and ensure operation followed guidelines that were supposed to govern Phoenix activities, though everyone understood guidelines were often honored in breach. Rules of engagement are simple. Henderson briefed PRU team through interpreter. Capture target alive if possible. Use minimum force necessary. Do not harm civilians. Treat prisoners according to Geneva Conventions. Document operation thoroughly, including evidence justifying neutralization. The rules sounded reasonable in briefing room. Implementing them during midnight raid in hostile village where distinguishing civilians from combatants was impossible in darkness would prove far more complex. We departed base at 0130 hours, 12-man PRU team plus Henderson and me, traveling in civilian vehicles to avoid attracting attention, parking half-kilometer from target village and approaching on foot through rice paddies where movement was difficult but concealment was better than roads. The night was moonless, good for tactical surprise, bad for visibility that would complicate target identification and increase probability of mistakes. The village was silent when we arrived at 0155 hours, most residents asleep, only occasional dogs barking suggesting anyone was aware of our presence. Ton deployed team in position surrounding target house, small structure indistinguishable from dozens of others except for intelligence indicating Comrade Bay lived there with wife and 3 children who might be present and would complicate capture or kill decision. Ready? Tan whispered at 0202 hours, team positioned, waiting for signal to assault. Execute, Henderson ordered, authorizing operation that would mark my first direct participation in Phoenix neutralization, beginning involvement that would continue 2 years and result in dozens of similar operations whose morality I'd question increasingly as program evolved. The assault was rapid. PRU team breached door, entered house with flashlights and weapons, shouted commands in Vietnamese for occupants to surrender. The sounds were immediately chaotic: screaming, commands, resistance, gunfire. Within 30 seconds, situation had escalated from capture operation to deadly force encounter that would leave target and one PRU operator dead, target's wife wounded, children traumatized by violence that destroyed their home and family. Target down, Tan reported at 0204 hours, operation concluded, but confusion about what happened requiring investigation that would never fully resolve contradictions between different participants' accounts. The official report stated, target Comrade Bay resisted arrest, attempted to access weapon, was neutralized by necessary defensive force. One PRU operator killed by target's gunfire. Target's wife wounded by crossfire. Children were unharmed physically. Target's death was justified under Phoenix rules of engagement. But Henderson and I, who'd been outside during assault, heard different story from entry team members who described Target as attempting to surrender, but being shot anyway, described wife as being shot deliberately after Target was down, described operation as assassination disguised as capture attempt gone wrong. The conflicting accounts were impossible to resolve. We hadn't witnessed shooting. Participants had incentive to describe actions as justified. Investigating allegations would undermine operations' legitimacy and our relationship with PRU team. This is how Phoenix works, Henderson told me during return to base. Intelligence identifies target. Team raids house. Target ends up dead. Official report describes justified neutralization. Reality is probably somewhere between justified defensive shooting and cold-blooded murder. We'll never know which because we weren't in room when shooting happened and people who have reasons to lie. Welcome to Counterinsurgency. It's ambiguous, morally complicated, and you'll never be certain whether you're fighting war or committing crimes. His cynicism was earned through previous operations. Mine would develop through similar experiences over next 2 years as Phoenix operations accumulated and moral ambiguities multiplied until certainty about what was justified and what was criminal became impossible to maintain. Part 2: The Quotas. July-December 1968. The pressure to meet neutralization quotas corrupted Phoenix from counterinsurgency program targeting legitimate VCI into body count operation where quantity exceeded quality, where anyone killed could be claimed as VCI regardless of evidence, where quotas incentivized killing rather than capturing because killing was easier and didn't require dealing with prisoners who might not actually be VCI. The monthly target of 3,000 neutralizations across South Vietnam meant provinces were assigned quotas. Districts within provinces were assigned quotas. PRU teams were evaluated based on how many neutralizations they achieved compared to quotas they'd been assigned. We need 30 neutralizations this month to meet quota, Provincial Phoenix coordinator told Henderson and me during August briefing. We have 17 confirmed, 13 pending operations. If pending operations are successful, we'll exceed quota and look good in monthly reports to Saigon. I need you ensuring PRU teams are operating aggressively enough to hit numbers. The emphasis on numbers rather than quality revealed how Phoenix was evolving. The program's architects had envisioned surgical targeting of senior VCI whose removal would degrade communist political infrastructure. The program's implementation became scattershot neutralization of anyone intelligence suggested might be VCI, with might be standards declining as quota pressure increased. The result was operations targeting marginal suspects whose connection to VCI was questionable, but whose neutralization counted toward quotas that determined program success and coordinator careers. September 12th operation typified how quota pressure degraded targeting standards. Intelligence identified 4 suspected VCI in village: tax collector, hamlet chief, schoolteacher, and farmer who supposedly provided supplies to VC units operating in area. The evidence was thin, single source reporting from one villager whose reliability was unknown, no corroborating intelligence, no direct observation of suspicious activities. But the 4 suspects counted toward monthly quota. Their neutralization would help meet numbers, and questioning intelligence would risk missing quota if suspects proved elusive. This intelligence is garbage, I told Henderson during operational planning. Single source, uncorroborated. Suspects are low level if they're VC at all. We're going to raid village, probably kill some people who might be civilians, count them as VCI neutralizations to meet quota. This isn't counterinsurgency, it's murder justified by bureaucratic need to hit numbers. You're probably right. Henderson agreed with resignation that came from recognizing problems but being unable to fix them. But if we don't conduct operation, we miss quota. Provincial coordinator looks bad in reports. Pressure increases for even more aggressive operations next month. The system incentivizes neutralizing marginally qualified targets rather than waiting for intelligence about legitimate high-value targets. It's fucked, but it's the system we're operating in. The September 12th operation killed 3 of 4 targets during raid that followed pattern established over previous months. Midnight assault, resistance claimed, defensive shooting described as necessary, bodies counted as VCI neutralizations, reported as successful. The 4th target escaped, was listed as neutralized anyway, because reporting escaped targets suggested operational failure that reflected poorly on team performance. The pattern repeated throughout fall 1968, operations targeting questionable suspects, raids resulting in deaths claimed as justified neutralizations, quotas being met through body counts that included unknown numbers of legitimate VCI and unknown numbers of civilians whose only crime was being at wrong place when PRU team needed bodies to meet quota. The American advisor's role evolved from oversight, ensuring operations followed guidelines, to participation, facilitating operations that increasingly violated guidelines we were supposed to enforce. We're losing the moral high ground, I told Henderson in November after operation that killed entire family, including children. House was mistakenly targeted based on faulty intelligence. Phoenix was supposed to be surgical counterinsurgency. It's become indiscriminate killing justified by quotas and dressed up as legitimate operations. We're creating more VC sympathizers than we're neutralizing actual VCI. This program is counterproductive. Henderson's response reflected growing disillusionment shared by many American advisors. You're right, but recognition that Phoenix is flawed doesn't mean we can stop participating. Our choice is working within system, trying to minimize abuses, or refusing to participate and being replaced by advisors who won't question operations we find problematic. I choose staying involved and pushing back where possible over abandoning program to people who'll make it worse. The rationalization, staying involved to mitigate abuses rather than refusing participation in program we considered immoral, was how many advisors justified continued involvement despite recognizing Phoenix had evolved into something darker than what architect had intended. Whether that rationalization was valid or was self-deception allowing us to avoid confronting complicity remained question. I couldn't answer satisfactorily then or 50 years later. The interrogation practices associated with Phoenix were particularly troubling. Prisoners captured during operations were interrogated to extract intelligence about other VCI members, about communist plans and capabilities, about infrastructure that programs sought to dismantle. The interrogations sometimes employed techniques that exceeded what American doctrine permitted: sleep deprivation, stress positions, threats against families, occasional physical abuse that crossed into torture. American advisors weren't supposed to participate in interrogations that violated Geneva Conventions, but we provided intelligence requirements that South Vietnamese interrogators fulfilled through methods we didn't directly witness but understood were occurring. Don't ask how intelligence is obtained, Provincial Interrogation Center Chief told me in December when I questioned sourcing for information that seemed suspiciously specific. You want intelligence about VCI? I provide intelligence. Methods are Vietnamese concern, not American. Your job is using intelligence for operations. My job is obtaining intelligence. We both do our jobs. Phoenix succeeds. You question my methods, I stop providing intelligence, operations fail. We both look bad. Better to not ask questions you don't want answered. His logic was instrumentalist. Results justified methods. Morality was less important than effectiveness. American concern about interrogation techniques was weakness that hampered operations. The perspective was common among South Vietnamese operators who'd been fighting war for years before Americans arrived, who understood stakes in ways Americans didn't because it was their country being fought over, who employed methods they considered necessary regardless of whether Americans approved. By December 1968, Phoenix had neutralized over 15,000 VCI in 6 months of operations, exceeding quotas, generating positive reports about program effectiveness, creating statistics suggesting communist infrastructure was being systematically dismantled. But the statistics obscured questions about whether people being neutralized were actually VCI, whether operations were creating more enemies through collateral damage and wrongful killings, whether program was sustainable politically given growing controversy about methods being employed. Part 3. The Doubts. January-December 1969. The controversies surrounding Phoenix intensified as media coverage increased, as congressional oversight began examining program, as critics characterized operations as assassination campaign violating both American values and international law. The Defense Department and CIA defended Phoenix as legitimate counterinsurgency targeting enemy infrastructure, pointed to neutralization statistics as evidence of effectiveness, argued that critics didn't understand realities of fighting insurgency that deliberately embedded itself within civilian population, making distinction between combatants and non-combatants difficult. But internal assessments were more critical than public defenses. A classified CIA study from March 1969 found that only approximately 3% of Phoenix neutralizations involved senior VCI cadre who were program's intended targets. The vast majority were low-level or individuals whose connection to VCI was questionable or completely absent. The study concluded that Phoenix was achieving high neutralization numbers by targeting marginal suspects rather than surgically removing senior VCI, whose elimination would significantly degrade communist capabilities. The program isn't working as designed, Henderson told me after reading classified assessment. We're killing thousands of people per year, meeting quotas, generating impressive statistics. But we're not significantly degrading VCI because we're not targeting senior cadre. We're targeting whoever is accessible regardless of importance. Meanwhile, we're alienating population through operations that kill civilians and destroy homes. The ratio of enemies created to VCI neutralized probably approaches 1-to-1. We might be strengthening VC more than we're weakening them. His assessment matched my observations from 18 months of Phoenix operations. The villages where we conducted most aggressive operations showed increasing VC activity rather than decreasing, suggesting that operations were radicalizing population, that families of wrongly killed suspects were joining VC for revenge, that Phoenix was feeding insurgency it was designed to suppress. April 1969 operation illustrated the problem. Intelligence identified village chief as VCI collaborator, who provided information to communists about government operations. The PRU raid killed village chief and 3 family members, destroyed their home, terrorized village that witnessed operation. Within weeks, village that had been neutral or mildly pro-government became actively hostile. Young men who'd been uncommitted joined VC. Villagers who'd cooperated with government stopped providing information. Hamlet that Phoenix was supposed to secure became VC recruiting ground. We just created 5 new VC in village that had none, I told Ton after operations aftermath became clear. The village chief probably wasn't VCI. Intelligence was likely fabricated by rival who wanted him eliminated. We killed him and family based on bad intelligence, alienated entire village, strengthened enemy we're supposed to be fighting. Phoenix is counterproductive. Ton's response reflected perspective common among South Vietnamese operators. Maybe village chief was VCI, maybe he wasn't. Doesn't matter, village needs to understand that collaborating with communists brings consequences. Fear is tool of control. If villagers fear Phoenix more than they fear VC, they'll cooperate with government rather than communists. Your concern about wrongful killings misses larger strategy. We're not conducting law enforcement, we're conducting psychological warfare. Dead village chief sends message that collaboration is fatal. Message is more important than whether specific target was guilty. The instrumental approach, treating Phoenix as terror campaign designed to intimidate population into compliance rather than police operation targeting guilty, was common among Vietnamese operators and some American advisors who concluded that conventional counterinsurgency principles didn't apply in Vietnam, where population was often sympathetic to communists and intimidation was only reliable method of control. But the approach violated American values about rule of law and proportionality, created situations where advisors were complicit in operations that resembled terrorism more than legitimate military operations. The My Lai massacre in March 1968, revealed publicly in November 1969, intensified scrutiny of Phoenix and similar programs. My Lai wasn't Phoenix operation, but public couldn't distinguish between different programs involving American forces killing Vietnamese civilians. The massacre demonstrated that some American units had lost moral restraint, were conducting operations that constituted war crimes, were operating in an environment where atrocities were possible when oversight was inadequate and moral standards degraded under stress of counterinsurgency that blurred lines between combatants and civilians. Phoenix is different from My Lai, Henderson argued during discussion about whether massacre implicated our program. My Lai was massacre of civilians by American combat unit that lost discipline. Phoenix targets VCI based on intelligence. Operations are conducted by Vietnamese rather than Americans. Neutralizations are justified by target status as combatants rather than their ethnicity or location. The programs aren't comparable, but the distinction seemed thin when Phoenix operations were killing civilians based on questionable intelligence, when quotas incentivized neutralizing anyone who might be VCI regardless of evidence. When American advisors were complicit in operations we wouldn't conduct ourselves, but facilitated through Vietnamese surrogates. The moral distance between My Lai and Phoenix was greater than critics suggested but less than defenders claimed. Congressional hearings in 1970 examined Phoenix directly. William Colby testified that program was legitimate counterinsurgency, that neutralizations targeted enemy infrastructure, that abuses were limited and were addressed when discovered. But testimony from participants contradicted official narrative, described quota pressure leading to wrongful killings, described interrogation practices constituting torture, described operations targeting civilians for political rather than military reasons. Phoenix is assassination program, one former advisor testified. The targeting is based on intelligence that's often wrong. The operations are conducted without legal process. The body counts include large numbers of civilians wrongly killed. American advisors are complicit in program that violates both American values and international law. Phoenix should be terminated immediately. The testimony was accurate description of problems I'd witnessed. But terminating Phoenix meant abandoning counterinsurgency effort entirely, meant accepting that VCI would operate without interference, meant conceding that America couldn't develop effective strategy for defeating insurgency that enjoyed population support. The choice wasn't between Phoenix and better program. It was between flawed Phoenix and no program at all. By end of 1969, I participated in approximately 40 Phoenix operations resulting in over 60 neutralizations. Some targets were undoubtedly legitimate VCI, whose elimination advanced counterinsurgency objectives. Others were questionably connected to communists, killed based on thin intelligence and quota pressure. Some were probably innocent civilians murdered for reasons having nothing to do with military necessity. The mixed record created moral burden that exceeded what statistics about neutralizations could capture, created doubts about whether my participation was serving legitimate military purposes or making me complicit in crimes disguised as operations. Part 4. The Reckoning. 1970 to 1972 and beyond. The final years of Phoenix saw decreasing American participation as Vietnamization transferred responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, saw continuing neutralizations that eventually totaled over 26,000, saw unresolved questions about programs' effectiveness and morality that would persist long after operations ended. The official assessment was that Phoenix successfully degraded VCI, contributed to security improvements that allowed broader pacification programs to succeed, demonstrated that targeted counterinsurgency could work when properly implemented. But alternative assessment was that Phoenix alienated population through indiscriminate killings, strengthened VC by creating martyrs and motivating revenge, corrupted South Vietnamese government by encouraging extrajudicial killings, and providing cover for political repression disguised as counterinsurgency. The contradictory assessments reflected ambiguity inherent in program that operated in gray zones where success and failure weren't clearly distinguishable, where same operations could be characterized as necessary counterinsurgency or unconscionable war crimes depending on perspective. I completed Phoenix assignment in June 1970, transferred to different role within CIA, continued Vietnam service through 1972 before returning to United States. The transition from Phoenix operator to conventional intelligence officer was jarring, from participating in lethal operations to analyzing them from distance, from being complicit in morally questionable activities to evaluating similar programs, from doing to judging. The psychological adjustment required confronting questions about whether Phoenix participation was justified service or criminal complicity. The post-traumatic stress from Phoenix operations differed from combat PTSD. Combat veterans struggled with having killed in battle, morally clear situation where enemy was identifiable and killing was unambiguously justified. Phoenix veterans struggle with having killed people who might have been civilians, morally ambiguous situations where targets were often unverifiable and killings might have been murders rather than legitimate military action. The uncertainty about whether we'd served honorably or criminally created psychological burden that combat PTSD literature didn't adequately address. Do you think we were war criminals? Henderson asked during conversation in 1985, 15 years after Phoenix, both of us struggling with legacies of program that followed us into retirement. We participated in operations that killed thousands of people based on intelligence that was often wrong, that targeted civilians along with combatants, that violated legal processes America claims to respect. Were we soldiers executing legitimate if flawed counterinsurgency, or were we murderers hiding behind bureaucratic euphemisms? The question had no satisfactory answer. Phoenix operations existed in gray zone where law and morality were ambiguous, where same actions could be characterized as necessary or criminal depending on unprovable assumptions about target's guilt and operational necessity. The legal and moral uncertainty was inherent in counterinsurgency that deliberately blurred distinctions between combatants and civilians, that operated in environments where traditional rules didn't clearly apply, that required judgments about legitimacy that couldn't be resolved definitively. The Vietnamese perspective on Phoenix was universally negative regardless of political orientation. North Vietnamese and VC characterized it as terror campaign targeting patriots, as war crime that demonstrated American moral bankruptcy, as program whose atrocities justified communist revolution. South Vietnamese who'd cooperated with Phoenix later distanced themselves, claimed they'd opposed program, described American advisors as having forced participation in operations they'd found morally problematic. The unified condemnation suggested that Phoenix had failed politically regardless of debatable military effectiveness. The program's lasting impact extended beyond statistics about neutralizations. Phoenix demonstrated that targeted counterinsurgency could be implemented systematically but raised enduring questions about whether such programs were compatible with democratic values, whether fighting insurgency justified employing methods resembling terrorism, whether victories achieved through morally questionable means were sustainable. The debates about Phoenix influenced how subsequent counterinsurgency operations were designed, contributed to restrictions on targeting practices and interrogation methods, demonstrated costs of programs that prioritized effectiveness over legality. I retired from CIA in 1990, spent retirement wrestling with Phoenix legacy that seemed increasingly indefensible as distance from war allowed clearer assessment than was possible during operations. The official narrative that Phoenix was legitimate counterinsurgency seemed less convincing with time. Questions about whether participation was criminal seemed more urgent. Desire to confess or justify seemed irreconcilable. The moral uncertainty would never be resolved. Too much time had passed. Too many participants had died. Too many records were classified or destroyed. The definitive accounting that might provide closure would never come. I'm 88 years old, veteran a program that ended 53 years ago. Survivor carrying guilt about operations that can't be undone and can't be fully judged. The Phoenix legacy remains contested. Some defend it as necessary counterinsurgency that successfully degraded enemy infrastructure. Others condemn it as assassination campaign that murdered civilians and violated international law. My assessment after 50 years is that both characterizations are partially accurate, and neither captures full complexity of program that existed in moral gray zones where certainty about right and wrong wasn't possible. The lessons from Phoenix are relevant to contemporary counterinsurgency operations facing similar challenges: how to target enemy infrastructure embedded within civilian populations, how to balance effectiveness against legality, how to maintain moral standards when fighting opponents who don't respect such standards, how to avoid creating more enemies than operations eliminate. The answers Phoenix provided were inadequate then and remain inadequate now, but the questions it grappled with persist wherever counterinsurgency is conducted. This was Operation Phoenix, the controversial program that neutralized over 26,000 people classified as VCI between 1968 to 1972, that achieved statistical success but questionable strategic value, that demonstrated both possibilities and dangers of targeted counterinsurgency, that created moral burdens for participants that exceeded what official assessments acknowledged. This is their story, told by survivor, preserved despite discomfort, serving as warning about costs of programs operating in gray zones where legality and morality become ambiguous.